Hello everybody, how are you going? Welcome to another Historica Canada video, the same people that make the famed Heritage Minutes, and so this one is a bit of a longer form one, being the Prohibition and the Yukon.
Beginning in the early 1820s, the temperance movement, a global campaign to limit alcohol consumption, grew across Canada, propelling the country into the era known as Prohibition, which lasted in part until 1948. Various temperance organizations in Canada, as well as a significant number of citizens and politicians, were increasingly contending that alcohol was a problem in Canada.
Wow.
At a time of little social welfare, poor water sanitation, and sometimes more taverns than streets, they argued that alcohol was a source of misery and moral decay, and an obstacle to economic and social success.
Interesting. It's almost like you can hear these things being echoed today in how some people actually go, well, it's really just another drug and it's just an abused substance and so many people have so many problems, but it's so prolific at the same time that people go, well, it can't be bad because everyone does it. When you go, hang on a second, is that really how it works? But just to be also, like they said, to be having the context of, the water isn't that great. Also seeing these images here, I don't believe I've ever heard of it being used as a war campaign, but it makes sense. Drink helps the enemy. He was for alcohol is against Canada and help me to keep him pure. It's so interesting. It's almost so, in a way, forward thinking, but it was the 1800s. So then for it to be reversed after a while really shows you where people's hearts and minds lie, I guess.
They argued that alcohol was a source of misery and moral decay, and an obstacle to economic and social success. In Yukon territory, the Klondike gold rush of the 1890s had left the region with a large floating population and a high number of taverns and alcohol sales to match.
Right.
Years after the gold rush ended, Dawson City's ratio of bars and saloons per capita was still 10 to 15 times the national average, and local temperance advocates rallied against the same conditions being highlighted across the country.
Wow.
Inappropriate and dangerous alcohol-induced behavior, domestic violence, health issues, low productivity, and more.
It just makes so much sense, and it, like I said, just feels so forward thinking, especially for the time, especially like they already said in terms of the water. I can't get over that part, just going, well, of course. I mean, that's always the story in terms of pirates and just sailors sailing the seven seas of the world, just going, well, we don't really have any water to drink. Sadly ironic in a way, as water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. And so, of course, you're going to be turning to the thing that can preserve, well, both your insides and also just outside on a ship or in the middle of the remote wilderness or anything like that. But yes, it does come at a cost often, like they're highlighting here. I mean, people do love it and they do have so many social aspects around it, but also you cannot deny the negative side effects of it. Coming back to these first photos though, the one on the left just does highlight the fact that I don't feel like it's ever really been acknowledged or represented correctly in terms of how the women were involved during the whole gold rush. I feel like generally you kind of have it like the guy in the middle, just a random guy out there just panning gold in the middle of the stream, and not having entire families and communities and both women and men alike just working together to try and make it just as efficient as possible. You know, you've thrown yourself out into the middle of the wilderness. You were definitely going to want to be trying to just capitalize on everything possible. Of course, you are going to have photos like on the right, which to my eye looks like it's all just a group of guys and man's best friend over there. But on the left, you can clearly see that I'm not sure if they've diverted a river or how they've managed it, but they're just going as a team. It's great.
Over several decades, the temperance movement grew. And in 1878, the Canada Temperance Act was passed. Although the federal government still controlled alcohol manufacturing, local governments now had the option to ban the sale of alcohol through popular vote. In 1901, Prince Edward Island became the first province to enact Prohibition. And by the outbreak of the First World War, Prohibition efforts reached their peak, championed as a patriotic wartime choice.
It's so interesting. I don't see how that would ever be the case these days. Like, it's just kind of an interesting choice where I guess it was rooted in the, okay, it's a lack of efficiency and you're having all these other problems, but I just don't see how people, even nowadays, would really have the guts to draw the line and go, well, hang on a second, let's just ban it nationwide, basically. I mean, yes, they did say that it was still in the hands of the federal government, but if you just have everyone independently choosing, it's nationwide. For Prince Edward Island, though, to be voting in 1901, in 14, 15, 16 years earlier than everyone else, that's pretty impressive, and I'm wondering, where did the message originally come from in terms of how did it spread across Canada, as it's a big landmass for 1900s, even the 1800s, I guess, at the time, so perhaps that could be why Prince Edward Island was so much easier and quicker to kind of enforce the entire thing. But I just love the fact that they were and still are clearly so aware of the fact that it's a lack of productivity and it just brings so many other problems that as a country you would generally think if you could get rid of, that'd be a good thing. And so if you can get rid of the catalyst of it all, well, maybe it's worthwhile, but clearly it just eventually came back swinging.
Still, alcohol remained legal in some parts, until in 1918, through the War Measures Act, Ottawa imposed nationwide prohibition for the remainder of the war.
Crazy.
It's important to note at this time across the country, Indigenous peoples were not included in either the conversation or the lawmaking resulting from the temperance movement. Back in the Yukon, the discontent around alcohol use had increased. In the first vote, the Wets won the day by only 3 votes. It did not go unnoticed that if women, who strongly supported prohibition, had the right to vote on the issue, the outcome would have been in favor of the dries.
Yeah, wow. 3 votes? There's no way. It would have just come down to someone just scribbling what they wanted in terms of someone high enough up just went, nah. As there is no way that in this time, for something that people are going to be so passionate about one way or another, I just don't see how you can only win or only lose by 3 votes. Yes, they don't have massive populations, but come on, 3 votes? Even like they said, for the women to then having a say in the entire situation, majorly skewing it to what, like probably 60, 75%, something crazy. It's a big deal, but it's still so incredible to me that Ottawa actually committed to the entire thing, going, okay, we've given each of the provinces their own choice, but now we've got a bit of a different situation on our hands. We need to be increasing productivity and just also not trying to have any distractions. So if we can just get rid of this entire thing, that would be perfect. So the War Measures Act 1914 came about, and of course it would have annoyed some people, as we're hearing about, and of course not every single person would have been involved in the entire thing, but just imagine how the world would have been different if this all would have been just carried on from that time. You know, you could argue that some people could have or find different outlets, but then people already find it different outlets, and that doesn't change this entire situation, one of the most popular ones in the world. And so if you did just roll it back 100 years and go, nothing, how would the world be different? It may even just change everyone's kind of addiction mindset.
In the first vote, the Wets won the day by only 3 votes.
It
did not go unnoticed that if women, who strongly supported prohibition, had the right to vote on the issue, the outcome would have been in favor of the dries. The women of Dawson City quickly lobbied to change the Yukon's Election Act and succeeded.
Wow.
2 years post-war, the Yukon voted for prohibition. It did not go as planned. The high number of alcohol-dependent businesses left over from the gold rush, combined with a sharp decline in population and lack of resources from Ottawa, created a perfect storm for economic ruin.
Of course, it's such an argument against the entire thing, but it doesn't make sense in terms of, you just wish that it didn't have to happen. But yes, if you do have such a high, what did they say, 10 to 15 times the rest of the entire country, that's outrageous for starters. So of course, when you have 90% of your buildings being saloons, you are going to be having some economical problems. And so, like they said, from a lack of support from Ottawa, that's all they really needed just to get them over that first hump, going, okay, your saloons are shut down, but we'll just enforce the banks to be open and the general stores and the clothing stores, smithing, anything like that. We can still help you here, just give you a bit of a leg up like they would have to do these days. Not always carried out, but like they would have to do, hopefully, these days. However, I do want to know more about how these Yukon women managed to change the entire thing around, as I would only imagine, especially considering by 3 votes, like I said, it just sounds so dodgy. There's no way that you can win by only 3 votes, and so for them to go, no, ladies, no. Clearly the Wets won. We don't want to listen to you. We don't care. But like they said, of course, the women are going to be in favor, especially because of the culturally appropriate or even legal things of the time. They're going to want to be trying to abolish that as much as the alcohol itself as well. And for it to only be taking 5 years is pretty darn impressive. It's not like they lobbied for years and years and years, like some things that we see throughout history just taking forever and just so much bloodshed almost, just about just one little change, where this is a big change that was already voted against and it only took 5 years. Meanwhile, the war's going on. That's a big storm. It was clearly actually very, very popular. And I just think there's a couple of bigwigs that held it back.
Barely a year after 40 votes brought Prohibition in,
Wow.
a 2-to-1 vote sent it back out.
Oh man, 2-1. Just after they won by 3, then 40 votes got it out, and then a 2-1. That's
At
crazy.
this time, the best and most common way to send goods to the territory was by rail via the White Pass and Yukon route, which traveled from BC through Alaska to the Yukon. However, the U.S. was now undergoing its own Prohibition era, and Alaska had been a dry state since 1918.
Oh no.
In 1922, the U.S. government placed an embargo on alcohol transportation, denying the newly wet Yukoners access to their alcohol.
No, they would be so annoyed. You're going, no, we're independent to our own degree. I mean, you're kind of at the mercy of this entire rail line, but still, we're independent. We had that, we've dealt with it again, and then we dealt with it again, and then now we're finally at our final form in a way, and then we still get cut off. That's just, you'd be so annoyed in that regard, but some people would also be so rejoiced going, yes, please, just US, please intervene, stop all this transport, because we just want to go back to the good old days where we didn't have it. However, that photo and especially the footage that followed it was just so impressive, and I still never understand how these rail lines even ever got built. I mean, what are they, just blasting through the rock and then building these bridges? But how do you even do that if it's just constantly cold? I mean, maybe in the summer it cleans up a little bit, but I just feel like in these areas it never warms up enough to be not snowing, and that just sounds like absolute torture in terms of a job. How do you possibly do anything when your hands are falling off from the cold and just have to hammer and pin and saw? Oh, it's such a brutal image of a job. Just no thank you. We can just send any robots up there to do that kind of job for us now, please. And you can just see the kind of territory that it goes through. Map of Alaska, Yukon Territory, and British Columbia showing connections of the White Pass and Yukon Route 1904. Oh, it's mental.
The U.S. government placed an embargo on alcohol transportation, denying the newly wet Yukoners access to their alcohol. This included a stockpile of liquor, then worth $100,000, sitting in a warehouse in Vancouver.
Wow.
The years that followed involved several schemes to bypass the embargo, including reviving an old treaty allowing the alcohol to travel by sea and up the Yukon River.
Ooh, wait, so surely just make it in the rest of Canada and then just send it round, or it was the rest of Canada still dry and they were wet. Is that the problem there? So they were trying to get it from the US and circumnavigate that, but then the US went dry as well and they were really got stuck. Surely everyone just would have been making their own. I don't want to try and deal with legislation. I'm not trying to deal with trains. Nope. Just not even boats. Nope. I'm just going to make it myself.
An attempt to categorize the alcohol as medicinal to allow it to travel through Alaska.
What?
And transportation via hydroplane. This last plan was particularly significant. Airplanes were still relatively new, and there was still much debate about the laws of the sky.
Oh, of course. That's like, what? Basically, if you did it now, you just send it up in a rocket and just then bring it back down straight where you need it. No, we didn't take it over land, not even via overland, which is via plane, which is going over the land. No, we just went up and straight back down. It just happened to land there. And at least now everyone can be safe with all their medicine. Like, how else were we going to be getting through the day? You know, chest cough, you got to be calming that thing down. But I do want to make sure that I heard her right. What did she say?
Via hydroplane.
Hydroplane. Yeah, I've never heard of a hydroplane. I've certainly heard of a hydroplane where things are going through the water efficiently, so to say, but I've never heard of that. Is that like a seaplane? A hydroplane? But then I don't understand why you wouldn't just boat it, because if you need a hydroplane, I guess maybe they can land on lakes, and that's what they're hoping for. Either way, it's a bit weird.
Airplanes were still relatively new, and there was still much debate about the laws of the sky. The United States would not formally assert sovereignty over their own airspace for another 4 years.
Wow.
And it was still unclear whether a Canadian plane flying over Alaska could carry alcohol.
Oh.
It was the opinion of American Prohibition officials, reinforced by a parallel U.S. Supreme Court ruling, that American territory extended above land, and that they were within their rights to impose their embargo upon the skies.
Oh man, they're just so committed to try and get their medicine that they're really trying anything. At that rate, surely you just go, well, you know what? I guess it wasn't so bad. Like, is this headache really worth it? This headache is not worth it for the headache that we got, so to say. But the Dawson City and everyone else just trying their hardest, probably just build your own train line. Like I said, surely everyone's just having their own moonshine at this point. I don't get it. I don't get how this hydroplane or the train line or someone just traveling via horse and cart, probably. I don't know how else they would have got it, but someone would have been finding a way somewhere just to be getting it in and selling it at exorbitant prices, and someone was collecting a lot of gold during this time. As much as the city had shut down, someone was banking it.
The decision that Prohibition extended into the skies was all over the news.
Wow.
It was considered an important step in developing international law. The decision galvanized conversations around air sovereignty and would help shape how Canada and other nations considered laws and responsibilities regarding air travel.
Wow.
After years of national and international negotiations at the provincial and federal levels, slowed by politics and bureaucracy, it was agreed that Canada would take certain measures to better monitor customs, including along the Detroit-Windsor corridor.
Interesting. It's just so incredible to me that this is all just kind of a little town in the scheme of things. It's not some major ancient city. It's just a little town that is having such a major impact on international law. And I guess that's the entire premise and why it's such an incredible video in a way. But just all the fact that it came from alcohol, what people are really focused on. And if, like I said, they want it, they're going to try and get it. And everyone else is just trying to throw blockages in their way. They've got the big American hand coming up into the sky. And I want to come back and just look at some of these other, they didn't really write them out, but important developments in international law. My favorite one is the top right one, being that air is no longer free, which would have been such a weird thing because yes, like I said, airplanes were very new, and all of a sudden, the sky is the limit, literally. You can just go anywhere, you can go as high as you want, and the amount of illegal traded goods would have been absolutely insane via the air, but they would have been expensive. But then just for them to be going, the air is no longer free, it would have been a big deal. I can understand how people would have been thrown from many loops. They'll go, okay, we can now fly, but now we're not allowed to fly.
It was agreed that Canada would take certain measures to better monitor customs, including along the Detroit-Windsor corridor, the source of 75% of the alcohol being smuggled into the U.S. during their prohibition, in exchange 75%. For permission to transport alcohol through Alaska to the Yukon.
Wow, someone would have been
The Suppression of Smuggling Treaty came into force July 27, 1925, 3 years after the embargo began.
Oh, that's just so quick. But it announced plans to suppress smuggling. Like I said, there would have been so much via boat, via rail, via horse and cart, via plane, everything. It doesn't matter how much beer you pour into the Detroit River, that thing is getting through. People want it clearly, and they're going to be paying for it, and they're going to be making sure that they just legislate as much as possible, find every little loophole to try and get it through, whether it's medicine or not. But US Customs agents readying to patrol the Detroit River, it really is just a military organization just to try and stop this thing. And I still just can't get over the fact that it was recognized that it was bad for the entire, maybe not economy, depending on whose economy, because it sounds like the Yukon didn't do too well, but realistically, if you just had the whole country being that much more productive and all the women and everyone else just loving the entire thing, it sounds like you could have definitely afforded to support the people that were malaffected by it.
Most provinces and territories repealed their prohibition laws in the 1920s. Prince Edward Island was the last to do so in 1948.
Wow.
The temperance movement and prohibition impacted many parts of Canadian life, such as women's suffrage and economic and social patterns. In the Yukon, the history of prohibition is one of social and political change, creative problem solving, and standing one's ground to drive national interest and international policies forward.
Yeah, that really is the most incredible thing about it. The fact that this little rural town and place in the world was just driving international policy just because of a little slither that really Alaska shouldn't own. If you look at a map, it goes, why do you have it? But the fact that they were driving international law is crazy. And the fact that another little place, PEI, held onto it for so long. I find that so impressive as well. You know, everyone else, 1921, 1919, 1948. Ages after everyone else. It's so crazy that they were first and last. Like, they really knew and stuck to their guns, which is admirable. You know, like we've said, it's definitely not the best thing for the world. Yes, the Yukon may have needed it, but that's just because they drove their economy so solely on the entire thing, gold and alcohol. So when both of them go away, no wonder your entire place shuts down. That's kind of just a consequence of your actions in a way. So for everyone else to be just going backwards and forwards so quickly, let alone Yukon to just be flipping between it a million times, as much as I can understand people just wanting to go back to the good old days where you could, and other people wanting to keep the good old days which are now being during the Prohibition, it's so interesting that even these discussions are still being had today. And like I said, what would the world be like if it just had been carried out just permanently?